All right, let's get it going. So, hello everyone. My name is Darris Cassidy. I'm a principal at Verivest and Fairway America. I'm joined by my partner and CEO of both companies, founder of both companies, Matt Burk. We'll give a little bit more of an introduction in a moment, but today we're going to chat about the do's and don'ts of fund management. So we've kind of outlined some of the things that we see our clients doing, some of the things we've done, both why you should or shouldn't do certain things across a variety of topics like capital raising, investor relations, administration, things of that nature. So that's really what we'll be talking through today. Please feel free to throw questions into the Q&A or the chat box as we go, and we'll try and answer those along the way. And then we will take some questions toward the end of this, and we'll try to stay on a pretty tight schedule. So this will not go longer than an hour. It may be shorter than that. So with that, a little bit of an introduction of Matt and myself and the two companies. Both of us have been in real estate finance our entire careers, which this says over 50 years of experience. That's, I suppose, true at this point. Verivest itself.
Unfortunately, I have the lion's share or an outsized portion of that.
Yeah. Well, I've been doing this since I was a teenager, basically. So that's been a long time ago as well. Having a teenage daughter at this point. But anyway, Verivest, we can get into a little bit, but high level, Verivest has helped hundreds of clients create, set up, launch real estate investment funds. Our other company, Fairway America, has run several investment funds, and the two companies at this point work closely together as we help to set up those funds through Verivest as they become administration clients, where we can do their back office administration, accounting, investor capital accounts, investor technologies and portals. Fairway America then considers investing into and alongside those managers, help seed them, help accelerate their growth. And really, so we're aligned with our clients in that way. And that's a big part of why we put out these educational videos to help people have success in being a fund manager. So anything else you want to add there, Matt? Otherwise, we can jump into the topic.
Yeah, I think that summarizes it. So dive right in, huh?
Yeah, so again, you can find more information at verivest.com. We are updating the website. That should be happening here in the next week or two. And so you'll see some more material on there to digest some products like fund financial models. There's a fund readiness audit that some of those are free items that you can go on and, answer a few questions and see if you may or may not be ready to launch a fund yourself. So the do's and don'ts, this is kind of going to be the format as we go through this. And it's really interesting. I actually outlined this probably 4 weeks ago or so. And we are at Fairway in the process of launching a new investment offering and most likely a fund format. And I've kind of broken a few of the rules that I put in here of what not to do, which happens. And I think this is
right.
And this is what's going to be interesting going through this is that this is why I know why people do certain things, and I know why that can be a good idea or what to look out for. So I'm well aware of some of the things we're doing at the moment that I'm saying to not do. But I think as long as you're aware of them, you can get away with certain things. None of these things are catastrophic if you don't follow them exactly. So just some advice to help provide a little bit of guidelines as you go. But this is feedback when you're considering launching a fund. So, and or after you've launched funds. So how do you take feedback from investors? You do want to listen to your investors as you're going out pitching. So specifically around capital raising. And we're seeing this with a lot of the clients we've recently helped launch funds that you don't know exactly what the questions and where investors are going to drill in. So before you go out to start raising. So as you raise capital, you're going to want to be listening really closely to what those questions are and start anticipating those questions and maybe answering them before they become questions. A lot of times investors can get nervous if there's too many questions, and they may not even follow through on asking the questions for reasons like they may not want to seem dumb, or it's just too overwhelming and they have too much, and so they're uncomfortable to even proceed with a discussion. So you really want to listen closely to those questions, start incorporating those into your deck, your marketing materials, and the presentations that you get. You want to get guidance from others that have run funds for, the reasons I just described. I think, Matt and I have raised for several funds and syndications, set up funds, and made a lot of good decisions and mistakes along the way. So I think learning from others is always a good thing to do. And then here's what I mentioned that I think we're doing a little bit of now, but for good reason. I said, don't listen to your investors about how to structure the fund before it's fully baked. That is hard to do in some circumstances, which is what we're facing right now. And this is one I'd like to get your feedback on, Matt. But what I found is a lot of times, specifically with high net worth investors, they're not entirely sure of all the nuances of fund structure and all the ways in which different decisions and decision points and variables are connected to one another. So I think it can be really confusing for managers to go out and ask investors what they think or how they think they should structure the fund, and get a lot of feedback from people that are not fund managers and maybe have the right intentions of helping, but can ultimately lead to a lot of confusion and even poor advice. So I don't know, Matt, if you want to chime in on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a super nuanced issue and answer, because it's easy to go down rabbit holes that end up leading you to nowhere. I mean, I do think that it's really important for people to understand broadly who their investor base is, right? And you need, because if you're targeting, for example, the California State Pension Fund and large institutional investors, that's just completely and totally different than if you're targeting unaccredited, to use an extreme example, unaccredited investors, right? And everything in between. If you're targeting family offices, if you're targeting high net worths, and it depends on the nature of your underlying assets. So there is no one size fits all. There's no panacea or perfect structure of a fund, but there are much better structures than others, depending on broadly who you're trying to attract. So I think a lot of managers make the mistake of thinking that they're going to attract investors that they've never dealt with before just by virtue of having set up a fund, which tends not to happen, right? Or they're not really sure and they're trying to attract everybody, and not every structure is attractive to everybody. So I think I don't think that you should, to your second point, just hear what someone else did who happened to be, targeting somebody different or who had a different asset strategy, and then extrapolate that and think that that's somehow going to work, right? So it's, like I said, it's nuanced. But so I think you need to know who your investor base is, but I wouldn't spend too much time, listening to a whole bunch of opinions and then trying to bake it around a bunch of opinions before you get going. There's better resources to provide better guidance than that. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that'd be my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I think that's what we'll find through the rest of these slides is there's nuances to these, and that's why I started off by saying these are not hard and fast rules. There's no catastrophic thing if you don't follow them. It's just, generally speaking, what you said is absolutely correct. You want to get good advice from the right people and not from those that don't really necessarily know what they're talking about. So the topic,
I know very well what they're talking about in their area of expertise, but it doesn't necessarily extrapolate to the situation of the manager.
That's exactly right. And that's like yesterday I had a call with an investor, and this kind of flows right into this raising capital, which is always, of course, on people's mind, the do's and don'ts. And this list could be, you know, a lot longer. And we've done specific webinars just on this. And I think our next one will be on capital raising. But you know, I had a call with an investor yesterday, and it wasn't about how to structure something, but in his perfect world, I was asking, you know, what are the objectives you're looking to achieve with considering an investment? And of course, he wanted, you know, fixed income and growth and depreciation benefits, but not with the K1 through a 1099, and diversity, but he wants to pick and, you know, and I'm exaggerating for the purpose of making a point. But that is what ends up happening, is these investors want everything, and it's just not, oftentimes not realistic, or it's not achievable for the manager, and then it can lead to a lot of just confusion where to go from there, because you're not going to be able to accomplish what a lot of investors may want or think they want.
Yeah, well, we've been that way plenty of times where you try to do many things into the document. You try to be all things to all people and please everybody, and it ends up, you know, being way too complicated, and not, ultimately you can't achieve all of those objectives, generally speaking, right, at the same time. So something has to give. So
that's right.
I think you're better off to decide more clearly what you're trying to do, what the nature of your assets are, who your most likely investor base is, and structuring on that basis, knowing that you're just going to have to voluntarily give up certain things that some subset of people are going to ask about. That as an entrepreneur, you're going to be tempted to want to try to accommodate them, but it just isn't realistic. So that's a hard thing for people to do, you know. But I find in the long run, you know, having made any number of these mistakes myself, that it's much better to do it that way if you can discipline yourself to do it.
That's right. So raising money, I mean, the do, and there's a lot of them, as I mentioned, but this has just come up a lot in the discussions with advisory clients, as we're getting first-time fund managers trying to figure out how to raise money. So this is what I put on here, is just do plan to spend money. It costs money to raise money, and that doesn't necessarily mean hiring outside people, which, as you can see on the don'ts side, you don't necessarily need to hire people, and absolutely be very aware that there are a lot of people out there that will claim they can raise capital for you. They'll, you know, and we have some clients considering paying huge amounts of retainers and capital and money to placement agent types, or those that claim to be that way. And that side of the business is just, I think, full of bad actors, or and maybe they come across really slick and they are good salespeople. But I've just seen time and time again, people promising to be able to raise a lot of money for people, take a lot of upfront fees and retainers and whatnot, and not perform. So I think, you know, these two sides tie together intentionally. Just if you are going to hire someone to help you raise that capital, the way in which you structure it, the way you vet them, I think is really important. And ultimately plan to do most of the capital raising, if not all of it, yourself, just because you're going to, or someone in your firm is going to be better at presenting the investment opportunity and understanding that than others. So Matt, I know we've obviously spoken a lot about this. We have been recently speaking a lot about this internally at Fairway. And really, we at Fairway have raised pretty much 100% of the money ourselves, without hiring outside agents, despite going down that path and reviewing that and looking at that. So there's that. As far as spending money,
spent plenty of money that hasn't really produced a lot of return. So I think you have to be very conscious of where you're spending the money. And I see a couple of questions in here, Darris, around, like, you know, what type of expenditures and a rule of thumb around spending money to raise money. I don't know if you have, I wouldn't say I have a particular rule of thumb, other than to say, you know, it's expensive. It's like any other cost of doing business. And I'd say it's a meaningful cost, higher than most other expenses that you're going to have, I would say. You know, and we have spent money, and I have seen dozens, if not hundreds of clients spend money on all kinds of things that they thought would help them raise capital. And some of them have proven to be pretty good, and some of them have proven to be a complete and total waste of money. And I would say that it's not always the same thing that is pretty good or a complete waste of money from one manager to the next. It depends on, personality and proclivities, what people like to do, where they feel comfortable. So again, I almost feel guilty because I say it's the same things over and over again, but there is no one way to do it. There's a lot of different ways to do it that I think people need to be very conscious when they make the decision about where and how to spend their money. And part of the hard part, Darris, as you well know, and this is true for us too, is like they don't really know which one's going to work or which one's not. So you spend a lot of money on things and you end up wasting a ton of it. So I feel like that's, a big part of the value prop that we try to bring to the table on clients is, helping, not that we're going to be right 100% of the time, but I think we can, like, I'll tell you a story that we had a client not too long ago who was, and I think you alluded to it, who was ready to spend, I forget what the number was, like 150 grand. They're going to write a check, 150 grand up front to some group that was supposedly going to help them raise, like 50 or 100 million or whatever some crazy number was. And this is a brand new first time manager. And I'm like, do you think that's a good idea? I'm like, no, I don't think spending 150,000, that's like paying my contractor, to build an addition to my house and giving him the money before he starts to work. Like, do you think that's a good idea? No. So I'll tell you what, you can pay me 75 grand right now. And I just saved you $75,000. So, so my point is, obviously that's an extreme example, but I see people do it all the time. So again, I think people need to say, okay, what am I good at? What do I like to do? Do I have the resources internally to do this? Or am I relying on some third party? I think part of your biggest part of your don'ts here, Darris, the underlying implication is there's no one out there really that cares more about your fund than you do. There's no one who knows your asset strategy better than you do, or how you underwrite, or why they should invest with you better than you do. So hiring some outside third party to go do it, especially on a new fund, almost never works out really very well. Because partly you can't get anybody who's any good at raising money to take you on in the first place unless they think they can make a lot of money on commissions, and they're not going to do that unless they raise a lot of money and they don't know anything about your fund. So I'd say probably the least likely thing to succeed for most brand new fund managers is to go out and hire some third party immediately. Now it's different if you're going through a broker dealer. So if you have a outside party and you've gone through a broker deal, but that's a whole nother world. Right now you're talking about getting, due diligence reports and getting somebody, and paying a bunch of commissions and baking in a bunch of extra fees. That's just a completely different deal. So, I guess I'm kind of covering a lot of territory here, but the point is, be conscious and thoughtful about what you're spending money on so that you're not wasting it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And like I said, we can and have spent a whole hour just on this topic, and I see a lot of questions around the topic. So maybe we'll circle back to this one toward the end, raising capital and talking about this. But, shameless pitch here, but, at Veravest, we do consult on capital raising for our clients. And I wrote about a 25-page capital raise starter kit that outlines every single thing that Matt and I have done to raise capital over the years, and what has worked for us, what hasn't worked for us, where we've spent money. And, what I tell our clients is, and you said this, Matt, what works for me may not work for someone else. And what works for me today may not work for me next month. And so it's always kind of fluid and changing. But I think the biggest thing is to analyze, just like a real estate deal, the return on investment you're going to get. So someone put in the Q&A, like, would you spend money on dinners and presentations? I mean, yes, generally that's a great way to spend money because those are going to dinners, especially lower cost. There's very low risk to doing that. And your return on that may be pretty good relative to that cost and time and risk. Whereas, traveling around the world and spending a lot of money and on presentations may or may not be the right thing to do, or hiring placement agents. So there's a lot to this. I recognize that. So
there's another question in here about, do they, if they're not part of the company or the C-suite, don't they have to be a broker dealer? That's a super nuanced question. I actually did a LinkedIn Live yesterday with our general counsel, Jay Zollinger, and we got into a bunch of conversations more on the legal side. So anybody who's interested in that, I'd say go to my LinkedIn profile, and the episode of Fundamentals that I did yesterday answers that specific question and a number of others around this topic. So
yeah. And someone else in here has like, how much percentage would you spend on events and this and that? I think one of the things that's big in that capital raise kit is touching on all the different events and conferences we've gone to over the years, and how fruitless that has really been a lot of times, right? And you go to family office conferences thinking you're going to meet a lot of families, and ultimately there may be some, but they're often
there's mostly other managers there trying to find families. And then when the family's there, it's usually a representative of the family who's there for the free stuff, and whose primary activity seems to be trying to avoid the managers as much as they possibly can, right, for the entire time. So that, it's good for meeting other managers, but it hasn't really been very good, at least in our experience, for meeting a lot of families.
And there's just a lot of rabbit holes like that you can go down, because it always seems like you're really close, and maybe the next event, maybe the next this or that, you're going to get that one family that's going to change everything. It's just not really how it goes.
We've found several families that seem pretty good, that then the next thing we did was spend a bunch of money to go and present at one of their events that they put on with families that ostensibly they were going to be on. And how much did we raise out of that?
Probably zero.
Pretty close to zero. So anyway.
It's hard. It's definitely one of the hardest parts of the business. So investor relations, have a plan, obviously. I mean, that, the cadence in which you communicate, I think, is important, whether that be quarterly. Some people do annually, some people do monthly. It depends on what works for you and your investors, but I think having an actual cadence to it is helpful for investors, and they can get accustomed to that. And then if you kind of get off that cadence, that's when you'll start, I think, receiving a lot of outreach from those investors kind of concerned. I also put in here, and this is something that we've been guilty of at points in time and have done really well at points in time, but reach out to your investors throughout the year for reasons other than trying to raise money. These are people that you should have a relationship with beyond the fact that they just invest money and you're providing returns. That tends to lead to more capital raising. And so that's really the purpose there. And especially it comes in handy when times get a little tighter or harder, the market shifts on you. And if you have a more meaningful relationship, I think the investors are easier to deal with when you treat them like, the people that they are, rather than just a transaction, which I see happen.
Yeah, I to this point about having a regular cadence. I mean, it's interesting. Like legally, there's no obligation to really communicate with investors on any particular cadence. I mean, you don't have to basically provide them anything, including financial statements or other than their K1. That's pretty much it. But I would say in the last 10 years, especially, with the rise of social media and investor portals and everything else and crowdfunding, I think the investor expectation has risen dramatically, right? So that even though it's not a requirement, I would tell you that it's sort of table stakes to have some way of communicating and providing meaningful qualitative and quantitative updates to your investors on at least a quarterly basis. Right. And quarterly seems, in my judgment, to be about the time that people start to get nervous, or 90 days goes by and they haven't heard anything, and they start fabricating in their own mind what may or may not be happening. Right. So I'd say quarterly cadence is good. Monthly is probably too much. This, it becomes, or it can become, an operational burden on a manager with a small staff, right, to have to produce this kind of material on a regular basis. So I think the big thing for you is to, try to figure out, how do you produce material that's meaningful to the investors, that gives them the information that they want, but doesn't give them a bunch of stuff they don't want, and do it consistently, without overburdening your relatively small staff. So just know going into setting up a fund that this is something to think about and be cognizant of how you're going to deal with it. As I say, I've seen it happen where people they either don't do it and it becomes hard to manage the investors, or they think they're going to do it. They overpromise the frequency with which they're going to do it, and then they don't have the capacity to do it. Right. So you have to be careful about your approach here.
And that leads right into one of the don'ts, and love for you to comment on this, Matt, because we've experimented a lot over the years. But in those communications to your investors, you don't want to overdo or provide way too much information and too many details, but you also don't want to be super vague and underdo that communication and leave a lot of things out there that they have questions about. Finding that balance is really difficult for managers, but I think important, because if you provide way too much information, most investors are not real estate people. So getting into just every single minor thing that has happened can be a little overwhelming. It can create some concern with investors, even if it's well-intentioned or you're just being really detailed. And similarly, not providing much information can make them feel like you're not on top of it and you're not paying attention.
Yeah, it's nuanced. I do think that, in my judgment, investors actually have a very finite number of things that they really want to know. And it comes down to, and sometimes there are things that you can't necessarily, that your lawyer will tell you not to tell them, which is what's going to happen next. Am I going to get my money back? Is the deal in trouble? Is the deal performing well? Right. And you can throw a bunch of statistics at them, at occupancy and NOI and this and that, and you should give them some information, but giving them all kinds of minutia, I'd say never really, it isn't helpful. It's not worth the time that it takes you to put that information together in terms of giving them what they want, right? So we've developed ways to try to minimize the time that we have to spend doing it, but still give them the things that they care the most about, and without, running into legal challenges about making promises or predictions about things that you don't control. Right. Yeah. So at the end of the day, I think investors, they're humans who have their hard-earned money at risk with you. So mostly they want to know that you're competent, that you're on top of it, and that you're capable, and that you're paying attention, right? And that you're communicating to them on a regular basis. So if you give them, fairly high level information, and you don't sugarcoat problems, right? And you don't, try to spin it more positively than it really is. You just shoot as straight as you possibly can with them about what's happening, and do it on a frequent basis, and demonstrate that you're paying attention. That's mostly that's 80% of what you need to do. And that doesn't necessarily require tons of time to do it. Yeah. Right. Anything above and beyond that with a bunch of minutia, I'd say by and large, most of our investors don't either read it or pay attention to it, or aren't fully capable of understanding or interpreting what it means in the first place. So to a large degree, that's wasted time with your staff that you don't need to be spending.
Yeah. And no matter how well you do any of that, this goes to the last point on the don'ts, you're going to have some loud investors. It's usually the same ones that are always not happy or expressing some suggestions on how you should do things differently. So I just put it here, don't let that one kind of alter your business or how you go about things. Of course, unless they're accurate in what they're saying or it makes sense. So I think I put this because I used to feel a lot of that pressure earlier in our fund manager days, where there would be one investor and it would make me feel like, oh, we need to change a bunch of things because this one person loudly said something that, maybe the other hundreds of investors aren't articulating. So yeah, anyway, it's just something to be aware of.
You have to pay attention to, like, look, if they have a valid, point, obviously you want to take the feedback into consideration. But I have found that, like, investors are humans, and if you have a large enough number of humans, there's, plenty that are totally reasonable. And then there's some that are completely unreasonable, right? That's just the law of large numbers.
Right.
So you have
Yeah.
to, be, able to discern between those that are providing meaningful feedback that can influence, how you run the fund and decisions that you make, and others who are just being completely unreasonable and not take it, personally, or not allow it to influence the way in which you manage and run the fund. And you'll have to deal with those people on a one-off basis. But that's just that. To Darris's point, I think, there's a propensity. Look, you've heard squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? It's the people who complain the loudest, they get the most attention. It's the 90-10 rule, right? So be cognizant of that, and just, put it in its proper place in your own mind, and stick to the fundamentals, which is, in my mind, what I described earlier. Be willing to give them the information that you need to give them, the stuff that they care most about, but be cognizant of not overburdening your time and your staff with a bunch of stuff that they don't really need.
Yep. Administration, really, administration can mean different things to different people. At Verivest, what we mean by administration, and what most fund administration is doing, back end bookkeeping, accounting work, investor capital account tracking, distributions. Oftentimes now, including at Verivest, it includes an investor portal and subscription documents and whatnot. So what I put here is to hire a third party. It obviously sounds, whether it's Verivest or another third party, that's not the point. It's just, I think hiring a third party is by far in the best interest of the manager and the investors. It will make the manager's life a lot easier. And some of what I'm going to get into is why it makes your life easier. I've been in the business a long time, and I'm still learning things about fund accounting, and it's constantly changing. And there's a lot of things that go into accounting. It's very complex and complicated. And so that's why I also put here, try to understand those nuances of the fund accounting, learn it along the way, because it's going to help you as a fund manager in a few different ways, right? So one is the investment decisions you're making, how you're structuring those, how you are estimating or projecting that individual asset may impact the returns to your fund, just because it's not always really obvious if you don't understand how it's going to be treated from an accounting perspective. So I think it's really important to understand the accounting as a fund manager, but I think it's also important to have somebody else, a third party, doing that accounting and administration for your fund, not only for security type reasons or protections for investors, but just because it's going to save you a lot of time and ultimately a lot of money, because it's relatively inexpensive. It's a fund expense, and you don't have to hire overhead at your operating company to perform that function if you were to do it internally. So any comments there, Matt? And then we can get into some of the don'ts on the other side here.
Yeah, I just think at the highest level, it's the nuances of pooled fund accounting are almost never the strength of real estate people, and frankly aren't really the strength of many CPAs who aren't doing this on a regular basis. So to me, this is one of the simplest, and smartest decision that somebody makes, going in. And, it's the whole reason we ended up creating this business model in the first place, was that, people were very scared of doing the administration as they should be, because I've seen, and even doing it as long as we're doing, I still learn new things on a regular basis that surprise me. So it's a simple thing to do.
Yeah, and you touched on this, and the number one don't that I had here is hire a fund administration company, not a CPA that claims they can do it for you. We've seen people do that. They have some relationship with a CPA, and nothing against those CPAs at all. But when it comes to the actual administration, I would just stick with fund account, admin companies. The CPA may very well be good at filing the tax return for the fund after getting the information from your fund admin company or something along those lines. But when it comes to the day-to-day tracking of everything, you want an admin company to do that. Also, I had here, you need to trust in your admin people. Don't try and go against their advice. Of course, that sounds really obvious that you don't want to do something that's breaking GAAP rules or accounting rules, but we see fund managers wanting to do stuff all the time that is not in line with how the accounting side works. Just a real high level overview of what I mean by something like that is that just because you have cash in your bank account doesn't mean you can distribute that and call it a return and show that you made some percentage of return to the investors. Those returns need to be generated from the income of the underlying assets, whether that be rental income or a sales income. But if it's some other form of cash, you can distribute it out, but it's going to be a return of capital to those investors and lower their capital account, and therefore lower what maybe your preferred return is being calculated off of. So these are the type of nuances that are important to get correct for a lot of obvious reasons why you need to get those accurate. But if we see managers wanting to go against that or investors wanting to go against that, and that's just obviously not a good idea. You can get in a lot of trouble if you start breaking accounting rules. So
yeah, I mean, look, and it's not that you can't distribute the cash; it's just how you characterize it. So, I mean, in the case that Darris is, the example he's giving is, prior to the end of the period, or prior to the calculation of all the financials at the end of the period, the manager thought they had a really good quarter. And so they went out to their investors and said, hey, we had a really great quarter. We sold some assets and, we're going to make a big distribution this quarter. And then they proceeded to make a big distribution. And then by the time all the financials were done, well, the expenses exceeded the income, even on the sales, which they produced a loss in the quarter, even though they had a bunch of cash. And then they went ahead and made this distribution, but there was no income to distribute. So there was cash to distribute, but not income. And it ended up being characterized as a return of capital and show a negative return for the quarter. Well, which is not what the manager said. So basically what you have is a manager who does not understand accounting, who's making representations that they just flat out didn't know what they were talking about. Right. So this kind of thing happens on a regular basis. So the whole point is, okay, if you learn this on the left-hand side, do try to understand the nuances of fund accounting and learn along the way, because it will make you a better fund manager, because you're giving accurate information to the investors, right, in a timely manner, and you're calculating it properly, and you're not making, promises that, or representations that aren't in fact, accurate. So it's just that's a good example. So we're, in the interest of time, we move on. So.
Yeah. So legal, of course, you need to use a competent securities attorney to sign off on your documents, put their insurance behind it, do other work along the way. It doesn't just stop when you launch the fund as far as some of the legal help that you'll need. So that's kind of goes without saying, but I think as you do that, and this is, kind of touches on the other things, just be really aware of the role in which that attorney is playing. They are good at what they do or they should be good at what they do as far as securities law. But when it comes to, your capital raising and some of the business decisions that go into a fund, how it's structured, someone just asked the frequency of distributions, whether it should be monthly or quarterly, those types of things. I think attorneys are not fund managers. So and someone else asked the question, who's the ultimate arbiter of the funds? Is it the attorneys because the managers don't know the law, or is it the managers because the attorneys don't know the business side of things? And I think that's a great question. And that's kind of the point of these comments here on the slide, is that both attorneys and advisors, or things like what we do at Verivest to help people on the business side of the decisions, I think can play an important role to get it correct. So you do absolutely need attorneys involved, play a critical part to this, but just recognize that they themselves are not fund managers, typically haven't raised capital, and dealt with real estate assets and whatnot. So
yeah, I would say, like, to the question, like, there is no ultimate arbiter on funds, right? I'd say to Darris's point, you absolutely need to want to have securities counsel who has signed off on the legality of the documents and who is representing you, the fund manager, in the preparation and the creation and the marketing of those offering documents, because you want to be protected legally. Okay, but that said, the lawyer typically will tell you what you can do and how you can make sure that it's legal, but they don't necessarily understand the interconnectedness of all the moving parts of managing a fund, which includes raising capital, managing investor relations, acquiring assets, asset management, fund accounting, the legal component, right? The lawyer is a spoke on the wheel, right? So it's an important spoke, and if that spoke's not there, right, the wheel isn't going to run in balance. But the lawyer is not the hub of the wheel; they are a spoke, right? So and listen, talking to other fund managers, I'd say, we understand what's out in the market. There's a limited number of places that you can go to get really good quality guidance around how to set it up properly in the first place. And that's the core of our value proposition on the advisory side of the equation, right? When we do fund creation engagements for people, because everything is connected to everything else, right? So just because some other fund manager, did a fund and structured it a certain way, doesn't mean that that's the way that you should do it. So I don't think necessarily relying on the, offhand guidance of some other fund manager is necessarily a great, idea either. Right. And even if you did, you still need an attorney. So, attorney is necessary, but they are not the be all end all about, all the decisions that go into making, the right structure of your fund.
Yep. And then the effort behind the funds, put here that running funds is hard. It takes a lot of time and dedication and work. And so you need to know that going into it, and don't, you don't want to get into a fund if you have hesitation about how much dedication you're going to put toward it. And we, over the years, have helped people set up and launch funds. And I think once that fund goes live, if you start taking in capital, that fund, is going to need to go on for some time period until you can work through the assets and wind it down. And winding a fund down is a lot of work in itself. So there's just a lot that goes into the funds. So be just super aware of that, and prepared to dedicate yourself and your firm to running that for an extended period of time, to get it up and live and off the ground and raise the capital, and then to manage the assets, and then to exit the assets and to return all the capital. I mean, that's a long time period that I just think it's really important for people to understand the seriousness of running a fund, which can be really great and rewarding and a fantastic business when done correctly. But it's not something to go in kind of just 1 foot in, 1 foot out sort of thing. So
yeah, you got to be committed. I mean, if you've got a business and you're raising capital from investors and you're committed to doing it, and that's your business that you're going to do for, the foreseeable future, and you're doing enough volume there, like Darris mentioned, we have the whole fund readiness thing that can help people understand, should I, shouldn't I, and we've had another webinar, I believe, on that topic. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of work, and it can be very rewarding, but you got to dedicate yourself.
Yeah. So I guess the summary is, don't try and do everything yourself. There are things to outsource. You're going to need an attorney, you're going to need admin. An advisory type company like Verivest could be a great value add to you. Maybe there's help on the capital raise side, maybe not, to some of the earlier topics, and which goes right into this. Do plan to raise the capital yourself, especially initially as you need to get the fund up and off the ground. So with that, we have a little time for questions. We have a couple that we can touch on here briefly, and then if anyone else has some, just throw those in the question box and we'll get to those. And if not, we'll work through these and then wrap up. You can see Kellen Stevens, his contact information is here. So if you're interested in anything that Verivest is doing, again, just high level for those that missed it at the beginning, Verivest is helping to create, launch, structure funds. We have securities attorneys that we work with that would then help to create the final offering documents, sign off on those that will make those introductions. We do fund administration. We have an investor portal. And then our other company, Fairway America, invests into managers to help seed funds and then help along the way to help grow and capitalize those funds through ongoing support and advisory work. So if you're interested to chat about that, Kellen Stevens is the appropriate person. His information is here. So please feel free to reach out to Kellen on any of those things. So with that, one of the questions, monthly distributions or quarterly, pretty straightforward question. Quarterly is more typical. Monthly can get a little much when you're doing that many distributions. It's also, especially in an open-ended fund, takes some time to close out the books on a quarterly basis, or excuse me, on any basis. So if you're having to close the books, calculate the returns, send out distributions 12 times a year versus 4 times a year, it's just a lot easier to do quarterly. I think that is usually investors' expectations as well. So you can do it either way, but that's usually where we steer people. We've done it both ways, and we've kind of regretted doing the monthly.
And I think it depends on the fund type too, right? A mortgage pool fund, if you're an income oriented deal where you're making loans, I think it's more of a realistic option to do it monthly if you want. I would say some investors like the quote unquote mailbox money, it shows up once a month. Instead of once a quarter, every 30 days, instead of every 90 from an investor perspective. If you're making distributions on a monthly basis out of a mortgage pool fund, there's some advantage to doing that. But I'd say operationally for you as the manager, it's burdensome, right? It's just a lot of extra work. It's 12 instead of 4. So, that's a question I think people have to ask themselves. If you're doing a real estate fund where you're investing in value add projects or whatever, and there's not a lot of cash flow, then you're not going to even contemplate monthly distributions. You may not even be doing quarterly distributions if there's nothing to distribute. So kind of depends on what kind of a fund it is, and then how you view the importance of investors psychologically getting their money every month versus the operational burden that it imposes upon you. In my mind, those are the practical considerations.
Yep, I agree. You touched on this a little bit, Matt. Sounds like, and I missed it, you and Jay is general counsel for both Fairway and Verivest, for those that don't know, but you guys had a chat yesterday about all sorts of things legal, I would presume. But the questions around whether you need securities licenses, and this question is it worth getting an RIA, Registered Investment Advisor designation, when you're launching a fund for credibility, and whether or not Matt or I are RIAs? That is absolutely a question for an attorney. I mean, you'll get a few different answers there. Fairway America is a registered investment advisor because of the size. Once you get to a certain size, you have to register.
Yeah, that's not entirely accurate. I mean, Fairway America Investment Advisors, FAIA, is a separate entity that is a registered investment advisor, and it represents our funds. And we did that because of the size that we reached and the number of funds that we had. So it's a super nuanced answer. And again, I would encourage people to, I did have that LinkedIn Live interview with Jay yesterday. And this is another question we specifically got into, was registered investment advisors, whether you need to do that or not. There are state specific requirements. And so certain states are more aggressive than others about trying to impose this and requiring people to do it. California, Washington, for example, So it's a nuanced answer. I think you'll get different responses from different lawyers as to whether you need to do it or not, depending on size and a whole variety of other considerations. So Darris is right. This is absolutely a question for your securities lawyer. So there is no one absolute correct answer.
Yep. So another question here, what kind of guidance can you give on raising funds? Do we have a network? That question, we do try and help people on advising on how to go about raising capital. We've done a variety of things over the years. And that's a little bit changing at the moment, with Fairway starting to help seed and invest into these managers. So those that we're doing that with, we're aligned with them and we want to help grow and accelerate the growth of their funds. So that is, I think, accelerating as to our involvement in helping people raise capital, but it's really difficult. So the question is, do you have a network? We have at times, we do have a network of investors that invest with us. How we go about turning those channels onto the clients that we work with is something that we're exploring. And I think you'll see that continue to evolve as time goes on here.
Yeah, I think high level for people who are not clients of ours and are just interested in getting more information about, capital raise sort of thoughts and guidance, we do offer that capital raise toolkit as a standalone product that would include some coaching, and happy to provide it to people, sell it to people. For people who come in as fund creation clients and then engage us for admin, and particularly for people that Fairway might make a seed investment in, we will generally give that information away as part of the broader relationship, because our long-term goal really is to partner with as many new fund managers as possible and help them grow and scale, because together, right, the more money they raise, the more money we make. And that's our whole business model, is try to how do we figure out how to find and identify good managers who want to set up a fund and want to be successful and are committed to doing it, and then participate in that success by providing them accurate administration, setting it up properly in the first place, and ultimately helping to capitalize the entity. So there's lots of stuff around that, and we try to meet people where they are. So if you don't want to hire us for those other things, that's fine. Happy to have just a conversation around the capital raise and do it as a standalone basis. So all this stuff you can chat with Kellen about. Kellen, by the way, has been with Fairway and Verivest for close to 16 years. So he's an extremely knowledgeable person that's not going to try to talk you into something. He's just a super good resource that knows a great deal about the business, has been around really since day one in terms of all the advisory work that we're doing.
Yeah. All right. Well, it looks like there's a couple other questions that are just getting answered offline by our client success people regarding where to find certain documentation or links to Matt's presentation he gave yesterday and whatnot. You can find both Matt and I on LinkedIn if you want to connect with us there. And or if you work through Kellen, I'm sure we'll cross paths that way. So with that, we'll wrap it up, and appreciate everyone's time joining us today, and look forward to chatting with anyone if you're interested in the topics that we covered here. Any final words, Matt?
No, thanks for coming. Enjoy doing these, and I appreciate the nice feedback from some of the people about the content, and we try really hard just to speak as straightforward and real deal as possible. So hopefully that comes through. People appreciate it, and I think anybody that works with us, you'll get a lot of the same. So thanks for being here. We appreciate it, and see you next month.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.